Live.
Hey! Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Energy of Star Wars Google Hangout. We're excited to bring you a Google Plus Hangout today that puts the science in science fiction. I'm Paul Lester here with Energy.gov, and with me today are some of the nation's top scientists representing 3 of the Energy Department's 17 national laboratories. They're here to answer your questions about the energy of Star Wars. So joining us today, first we have Cathy Plesko, an applied physicist from Los Alamos National Laboratory. Cathy uses supercomputers to model what happens when an asteroid hits a planet. Hey, Cathy.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Hey. Next up is Vishal Patel, a researcher from Idaho National Laboratory Center for Space Nuclear Research. Vishal studies new forms of nuclear power that could fuel tomorrow's spacecraft.
Howdy.
Hi. And joining us from the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, we have Peter Thelin and Chris Ebbers. Chris is a physicist who uses lasers to study crystals, and Peter is a master optician who is an expert in cutting and shaping materials by hand so they can one day be used by Lawrence Livermore researchers to explore the universe. Hi, guys.
Good morning. Hello.
And welcome again. And before we get started with the questions that we received from Twitter and through email, one disclaimer before we get started: we're going to stick to just the Star Wars movies. There's a big Star Wars universe, and for this discussion, we're going to stick exclusively to the energy of the Star Wars movies. So is everybody ready for questions?
Let's do it.
Absolutely.
Cool. So the first question is, at one point in Empire Strikes Back, Luke plugs in R2-D2 to give him power. That suggests he's battery operated. What kind of battery technology do you think could be in use there?
I think we're going to defer to Vishal at Idaho National Laboratory on that one.
He is the energy expert.
He is the compact energy expert.
Well, so if it was an actual battery, I would not be the expert here because we do nuclear work here. But in terms of energy density for what R2-D2 is, I don't know what the next generation of battery technology would be because R2-D2 has a ton of subsystems that can do communications. He's got a little taser on him. He can move himself, and so he seems pretty energy intensive. So the idea that he's actually battery operated seems a little bit questionable. I would argue that there was some sort of power source on board of R2, and possibly the plug-in part was more for just maybe some subsystems that need a little bit more energy at once. So you'd have your battery there to give you kind of peak power, so you have that charge for it. So I don't think it's a super big jump to say that. So we can go with that.
So Vishal, do you think it had 2 batteries?
Why would it need?
Do you think the R2 unit would have like a radiothermal generator like the Curiosity rover does for part of it, and then
that's what I would imagine.
Oh wow! So what would that look like? What does an RTG look like? Is it the size of a coffee cup? Is it the size of a loaf of bread? What are we talking about? How much of R2's trash can is taken up with that?
Most of it.
Most of it?
You have a little bit of shielding concerns, but most of it would probably be the RTG. So maybe there was a more exotic form of matter that maybe a little bit higher power density than so Curiosity's RTGs usually use plutonium-238 as the heating source. So perhaps there's maybe a shorter-lived, higher power density isotope, perhaps americium or so, that could be made into a smaller battery, so not all of R2 would be taken up.
Now, if from our perspective, both in kind of an artistic and futuristic, we would maybe go for a nucleonic, isomer power source, and maybe what Luke was doing was he was plugging in, he was recharging a source that had a small particle generator that would recharge his isomeric battery, kind of a high nuclear power density, and we'll go with a direct conversion technology. Because we're limited in today's technology, the RTG thermal generators that are used on, I think, what's the farthest spacecraft out there? It's it's Viking or Explorer.
Viking or Explorer. I think it's Explorer.
Yeah, so that's about a kilowatt, I believe, and maybe it's down to about half a kilowatt. But maybe in the future they have some direct conversion technology that will take the particle and be much more efficient. So I think you've described accurately what we can do today, and it's R2D2 looks like he has a very complex power source. So and it has to be some small fraction of his mass.
All right, those are all great, fantastic.
Going with future technology of undetermined origin.
Right. Great. So, so move on to our next question. On Planet Hoth, we see what the power generators look like. What do you think about that power generator? Is it some kind of nuclear reactor, fusion power?
It wouldn't be nuclear.
Yeah.
Why not?
There we go. There was a
too many
disturbance
waste
in the
products.
force.
Disturbance in the force.
Yes.
So,
Fusion.
Fusion?
a small fusion reactor. I think there is an entire. We have a shout out to Dr. Curtis Saxton, who's now I don't know if we can see that, but Dr. Curtis Saxton is now at Technion University. He was at Sydney. So he's now at Technion University. So he ended up providing a very comprehensive background of the energy that these devices use. And so, but I think on Planet Hoth, that might be something that we could actually make. With today's technology, it might not be as compact. So, obviously, we don't have a working fusion reactors today, but geothermal or any extremely compact nuclear reactor with shielding. Again.
That's great. So we have another question about the thermal exhaust port that the rebels used to blow up the Death Star. Did that really necessary? Was that really necessary part of the Death Star? And did it keep the reactors cool? And was it just a complete design flaw by the Empire?
I think the technical term for that, the technical term for the exhaust port on the Death Star is MacGuffin. That is a plot monster that was there to be shot at to make the last scene awesome. But I imagine that a space station the size of a small moon is going to have some way to use and dump its heat, because it's probably going to be making a lot more with all of the computers and all of the different servos and laser cannons going on there. You're going to have a whole lot of heat. But the gotcha that I saw with that is they're using an exhaust port instead of fins to radiate off into space.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're using an exhaust port, that means you're venting gas out that port. And that means you've got a hole from the inside of your Death Star where you've got an atmosphere out into space. And that should be venting way worse than a balloon that hasn't been tied off.
So yeah, anytime you have, I think one of the hardest part for us as for our civilization in terms of traveling through space is power sources, and we have great power sources. The problem is every power source you have is going to have some type of heat sink, such that you have to dissipate that heat in order to make your conversion cycle to work. And so what we call they're called radiators in space, and they look like like Cathy said, some fins or some type of exotic. We try to think of these things every day of like how we can make a better, smaller radiator, because those are sometimes 20 to 30 to 40% of your system's mass. So the idea that you'd use an exhaust port actually sounds really cool to me. The reason we can't use exhaust ports usually is that because you'd be venting whatever your working fluid is, so at some point you run out of working fluid, and then you can't use your reactor or your power source. But a moon-sized Death Star should be able to carry a lot of its coolant with it. So perhaps it was an exhaust port where it actually was removing its heat source instead of using a radiator. Sounds pretty reasonable.
But Vishal, wouldn't that spin it up?
Spin it up?
Because you're venting in a specific direction, so you have force that's going along that direction that's then tangent to your Death Star sphere, and then you're going to push the Death Star the other way and start spinning it, right?
Well, I mean...
So you'd have to have another exhaust port for equal and opposite reaction. You'd have to have another exhaust port exactly opposite it on the other side.
And there's also, the Death Star itself has propulsion mechanism such that it could counteract its the offset of that thermal exhaust port. Okay, that's good.
That's great. Thanks for the great answers.
In the form of energy instead of gas? Light?
Yeah, I mean, we have to also remember they have some type of magnetic confinement technology that keeps an atmosphere in, so maybe these exhaust ports or the entire sphere of the Death Star had a shield that kept an atmospheric process in.
And the proton torpedo or whatever they were using was able to penetrate that shield.
Yeah.
And speaking of deflector shields, it's actually our next question. And the deflector shield on the Death Star, can you see it? No, not coming down. Don't see it. Have our Death Star. Is it coming? There we go. All right. Okay.
Nice Death Star.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. So, does a technology exist to create a real-life deflector shield, like the one you may see on that Death Star over there? Do we have the technology for deflector shields? Too far.
Well, I think
the Earth has a deflector shield.
The Earth has a deflector shield for at least charged particles. So we have a large magnetic generated moment in the Earth, North Pole, South Pole, and we are able to deflect a lot of cosmic radiation or charged particle radiation from that. I don't know how you would handle that's a force acting on charged particles where it feels a force perpendicular to the motion of the charged particle, but
instead of a macro force like a solid object.
Right.
But lasers, focused lasers, high energy lasers produce shock waves. So energy can produce physical shock waves at high enough energies, right?
If there's something to interact with.
Well.
So yeah, and of course you're in the air.
What about suspending a field of charged metallic particles and using that as a plasma? It'd probably burn up. Never mind.
Along those lines,
chainmail.
Yeah, it's a
chainmail.
A type of particle chainmail.
Nanoparticle chainmail.
Along those lines, I think my favorite real-world concept of a deflector shield is using some type of physical media, such as your chainmail. You've seen in other sci-fi shows where they'll kind of just like put up a barrage of maybe guns and just shooting ammo out, and you can't get through that field because now they're just whatever you throw at it gets hit by those guns. And then in terms of, but I really like the laser shockwave idea, where essentially if something's coming in, you can sense it's coming in and cause some sort of shockwave to deflect it using that physical media.
similar maybe to reactive armor that's used on some tanks now, where a projectile hits the armor and it blows up and basically cancels the force, the opposing force.
I think it sounds like in the Star Wars universe, at least in the first three, the canonical real movies, I'm totally going to get flamed for that, but in the real movies, all of the weapons seem to be based on charged particles. So if the Death Star's laser is actually, say, an electron beam, which would look different, but if that was the case, and if the rebels are always fighting back with charged proton torpedoes, then maybe a magnetic field is the right answer. Maybe that magnetic braking is what you need. And just because we are in a different place with our technology where everything is based on projectiles, that doesn't work so well. You can't use a magnetic field to stop a projectile that isn't paramagnetic, that doesn't respond to a magnetic field. But maybe if you're just firing protons at everybody, that works pretty well.
Yeah, no, that sounds good.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you have a magnetic field like the Earth does, and the Death Star could generate a magnetic field strong enough, it could suspend these barest nanoparticles
Outside of itself.
outside.
Yeah.
Hmm?
As well as provide a magnetic field against all charged particle beams.
There you go, protecting all of the soldiers inside from radiation.
Great. So let's move on to our next question, which is, what would be the most practical method of powering a planet-wide city like Croissant, and how much energy would it need? Obviously, this is a complete, I could totally make this up, but yeah. So just how about it?
We're talking around 1 trillion people on the planet. Just throwing it out there.
Wow.
7 billion we have on Earth now.
Need a lot of power there.
So Vishal, how little power do you think we can get away with? Because right now, our houses aren't as efficient as they could be. Our devices are not as efficient as they could be. There's a lot we could do to reduce the amount of power that any one of those trillion citizens would need. What's the least you think we could get away with?
So if we look at planned Mars missions, the ones that we want to look into going, NASA's looking in the 2030s range of going to Mars. They're talking about using power on the order of kilowatts. So this is less than the power that you normally use in your own home to do a whole manned Mars mission. So I would wager
What would that be?
on the order of kilowatts, so tens of kilowatts.
So tens of kilowatts for like 5 people, tens of kilowatts for...
I think it's closer to probably 3 people. I don't know exactly how many people they were looking at, but let's say 3.
So total mission in kilowatts, because I mean my power comes in, the bill's in kilowatt hours, so kilowatts per hour.
So I'm talking about
Ours
energy.
is going to be a couple of years, right? 18 months, 6 to 18 months.
Yeah, and so
Wow.
that would be the
that cuts
10
it down
kilowatts
quite a bit.
for the sustained amount. Sorry.
You're fine. What were you saying?
I was going to say yes, the tens of kilowatts for the sustained duration of the mission.
Wow. So kilowatt years instead of kilowatt hours.
Uh-huh.
So that brings down your usage by a factor of 300.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
Oh, so your usage goes down by
Yes.
300? Because, sorry, yeah, kilowatt hour to kilowatt year, that's more than a factor of 300. That's going to be, what, a factor of 3,000-ish. That was a factor of 10 between friends. I'm a planetary scientist. What do you want?
Well, certainly the technology we have now, I mean, right now for if you wanted to have a planet that wasn't going to, where you're burning all your fossil fuel, you would switch over to nuclear as a intermediate step. But, and the next power source might be the same as that of the sun, which would be, of course, fusion-based. Not to plug NIF, but you have the magnetic fusion energy plant being built in Cadarache, France. You have Sandia, Los Alamos are both contributing on Z-pinch fusion. And LLE, Rochester, direct drive, and then NIF is direct drive. Rochester is indirect drive, and
NIF is direct drive.
Sorry, Rochester is direct drive, and we're indirect drive. So there might be hopefully a fusion power source providing that kind of energy for planet-wide. But certainly in the interim, I think you would definitely want to start building safe and efficient nuclear power plants.
So for that trillion people, given maybe 100 or so kilowatts per person, maybe that's too high probably, but that's what I just did. And you assumed, your power plant producing, a gigawatt of energy or so, you're going to need just tens of thousands of nuclear plants to make this happen. To power Coruscant.
But Vishal, if we then work through the efficiency like you and I were just talking about, and you can knock that down by a factor of a couple hundred even, you're talking about maybe a couple thousand power plants on a planet. That's starting to sound like numbers we already have.
Great. So moving on to some of our favorite weaponry in the Star Wars universe. We have a question. Could we contain plasma energy with strong enough electromagnetic field, like a lightsaber, to use them for things like mining or other processes?
Well, we contain plasma in magnetic fields now, but we don't have an open form of containment.
We just happened to pick up a lightsaber at the Target Walmart type store, so it does. Well, I shouldn't touch the plasma, of course, but there we go. Doesn't quite fit under the screen, but it does glow. Should be. Yeah, there we go. Great. It actually does show up. In any case, yeah. My worry is.
Well, actually, let's follow this to its logical conclusion. Let's say instead of holding it in an invisible magnetic bottle, you actually have a physical. Something physical that extends when you turn it on, something very thin, but it can
metallized.
Yeah, we're talking about a very exotic universe with exotic materials we don't have now. So they have a material that is able to hold a powerful magnetic charge and hold the plasma, and perhaps that material is constantly being burned off, but constantly being replenished. I mean, after all, like you said, this has probably got a fusion reactor inside.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about people walking around with fusion reactors hanging off their belts and a spare one at home, and their land speeders powered by some really exotic power technology that these people take for granted. So power is not an issue for these folks.
Right.
You're talking about a universe where power is not the issue and materials are not the issue.
Because certainly, if we had something like this, if I looked at it from a laser point of view, we have lasers that can cut through 3 feet of hardened concrete in a few seconds. That's about a 30,000 watt laser. If we said it was 75% efficient, that's a 40,000 watt electrical device. But unfortunately, that would be 30,000 watts in the plasma. 10,000 watts being radiated as heat in my hand, and so they obviously have a much more efficient power technology than I have as a laser physicist.
They're capturing all the heat.
Yeah, they're capturing all the heat somehow and using it.
And recycling it.
So
photon recycling.
Yeah, photon. There we go. We should patent that.
I think it is, actually.
It is patented. We'll patent the next one then.
All right. For laser hair removal.
I'll turn this off and put it away.
Great. So, also on the topic of lightsabers, we got another question from Twitter.
Here.
Which color lightsaber uses more energy, red or blue?
Oh, blue.
Blue, definitely.
Green or blue?
Green or blue, we would imagine. It's because it's putting off green or blue photons, which are higher energy. That's our guess based upon the color.
Cathy, Vishal?
I will second that. Yeah, the shorter wavelength light takes more energy, and so yes, that would be my assumption too. Is the longer wavelength, lower energy red photons are not going to take as much energy to generate.
I'm not ready to disprove black body radiation yet, so I'm going to agree with them.
Awesome.
Which is why all of the double-ended lightsabers should totally be red. I
think Darth Vader's was red, which is problematic. Since I think we were all on the side of good.
Great. We're all in agreement then. So moving on to fuel sources, we have one question about do we possess a fuel which would be able to power the Z6 model jetpack used by both Bubba and Jango Fett? Does anybody have a sort of guess as to what the fuel would be for that jetpack that Bubba Fett uses?
The same stuff powering lightsabers?
Would it be the same power?
I would say that. Again, you're talking about people where energy is not the issue. So they're probably not using conventional fuels that we burn, except in their little hibachis, which they apparently like to cook on.
Obi-Wan was cooking on a hibachi. Wow.
Yeah, and so is Yoda.
And he has a fusion power reactor, two of them, sitting in a trunk.
Yeah.
But I think
well, they're a steampunk society, basically.
So in terms of, I guess, staying with the spirit of this discussion, we have to think of a power source for it, right? So this would be kind of like an Iron Man type of power source. I think Tony Stark, his little fusion reactor in his chest. If you can make a little reactor that small, you could absolutely power a jetpack to move around. I don't know what the smallest fusion reactor paper or not we ever have, but it could be a good power source. But in terms of actually, trying to do that, it'd be a lot harder to do for a personal-sized jetpack. But if we were talking about something bigger, like a gigantic robot the size of the building, sounds a lot more easy. I just call it a rocket engine. We have those, but.
Great. So, keeping with the lightsaber theme, we've got another question. Considering the size of the power source, how does the energy density of a lightsaber battery compare to our best batteries?
Yeah.
Doesn't sound the battery.
I might have done some calculations.
Oh, okay.
Perfect.
All right, my source is in one of the non-canonical by Cathy's view. In episode 1, there's a really boring scene towards the beginning where they're on that Senate spaceship or one of those. They're having a meeting. They get stuck in a room, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, and they need to get out. They bust out their lightsabers to melt the door. Let's say the door was steel. Steel has a heat capacity. Let's say it was, some massive steel. We make a little guess. So we know, just looking at how much energy it would take to heat up the steel to its melting point. So not even considering the heat fusion of the actual melting process. You'd get around 104 megajoules, give or take. So let's call it 100 megajoules of energy was expanded in about 10 or 15 seconds. So let's call that 10 megawatts. So that's the energy you're looking at in terms of running that lightsaber. Maybe it's peak power. Maybe it's always running at the same power, but I couldn't answer that one. So so we'd need a 10 megawatt energy storage times however long the lifetime of a lightsaber is, and divided by that will give you at least the size of it.
Cathy, do you have anything to add?
That sounds about right. I have not done the calculations, and I think Vishal's got the right track going on there. I think that using the steel door case is a good metric for estimating ballpark what the power would be. And that is assuming it's got a battery, right, Vishal? That's not assuming that it's got a
it's very hard to believe now, if we're talking about a battery, it's going to need, at the minimum, that 100 megajoules of energy storage for that one time. But they've using it at Holstein, so it must have more energy than that.
Yeah, I think if there was this is a target, again, about the same size as a National Mission Facility target. Laser beams come in from the top and from the bottom, but you could imagine in a different world where they could this would generate on the order of, if it's got a gain of 20 and a break even, well beyond break even, 4 megajoules of energy. If you could imagine in some different Star Trek world, sorry, my apologies, Star Wars world, where you could achieve fusion of those small number of atoms without the need for
intense shielding
and the laser behind you, that you could obtain that kind of power, in a fairly, fairly small device if you have some type of, fusion or matter to energy.
Something to keep in mind, in the original Star Wars movie, when Luke is overpowered and the sand guys are tearing apart his land speeder, it's just sitting there hovering all by itself as they're rifling through it. It's just bouncing along. It doesn't seem to be running. So they have these super cool technology. Their ability to handle energy to allow this thing to levitate, apparently at idle or even shut off. So containing power and containing the power of a reactor seems to be within the magnetic bottle you would need.
Yeah, and apparently it's so commonplace that the sand people don't even want the land speeder. So it's the Ford Pinto of its time. It's something I always wanted. We had a Ford Pinto when I grew up, but great car, but relatively.
No offense to Ford people out there.
Absolutely not. No, because we have a Ford Fusion. Right. Fusion, of course. But in any case, that apparently they didn't even want the land speeder. And when I saw the movie when I was young, I was amazed. That's what I wanted. I wanted a hovercraft, a gyrocopter, or a land speeder.
We're close.
Good transportation sources. Cool. Great. Anything else to add on that question, y'all? Vishal or anything else? Cool. So our next question is about energy efficiency, and I don't know if this is even a possibility, but is the Death Star energy efficient? My guess is no, but maybe they had some LEDs or something like that in Death Star. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really dark place. It might actually be, one of those lead buildings, or the I don't know if you have lead spaceships. Sounds reasonable.
It certainly has the ability to divert power pretty fast. I get the impression that they're running pretty close to the edge of what their power generation facilities can do when they power up to destroy Alderaan. That's a lot of energy, and you see things sort of, powering down, the lights are dimming, people are a little stressed out there, even the ones you can't quite see because they're under masks. But if you actually look at the amount of power that takes to destroy a planet, there are very specific technical definitions of what it means to disrupt a planet like that in planetary evolution and planetary science. And it's a whole lot of energy. I don't know if there are any questions, Paul, about that we won't go into in a bit. But I have done that calculation.
Oh,
so
great.
I can tell you how much power is going into that burst.
Yeah,
I've done it too.
All right, let's compare numbers.
Yeah,
okay,
great.
So to disrupt a planet, you have to fragment it such that the largest piece left is half of its original mass.
I didn't do that much.
E star D is that amount of energy. That's the technical term.
I went the Physics 101 route.
right? And then you go the physics 101 route and say, okay, well, to take half the mass and remove that out to infinity, then you're into work. So it's the mass times gravitational attraction times the distance you're moving it to, right? And that's the big one. So from there, assuming you're using a planet that's about the size of Earth, and if you look at Alderaan, it's got blue-green world thing going on, it's probably going to be at about 1 AU, because if it's much further, it's going to get too cold, start looking like Mars, or the sun's going to have to be much bigger, its star. So it's going to be ballpark 1 Earth mass, right? So if you're blowing away half of an Earth mass, that's going to be 3 times 10 to the 24 kilograms, right? And so you're shooting that off to infinity. We're then talking about energy in joules. So 1 joule is the amount of energy it takes to lift something about the size of a big apple about 1 meter, 3 feet off the ground. So you're getting into the range of 10 to the 24 or 10, multiples, orders of magnitude larger than that, joules. And so 1 times 10 to the 24, that's a 1 with 24 zeros after it, joules, is 1, and I couldn't have made this up, Yoda joule. That's Y-O-T-T-A, not Y-O-D-A, but that is a Yoda joule. So really? What are your numbers looking like, Vishal?
I'm like 6 or so orders of magnitude higher than you.
Okay.
I just went with the gravitational binding energy, and I assumed that that we didn't take into account the energy required to actually break the Earth or Alderaan apart. So if you just take that, just the super simple numbers, you get around 2 with 32 zeros after it.
Yep. Okay, and that's from taking it out to infinity, so that's the height term. Okay, yeah, I'd buy that. So that would be a million Yoda joules.
Yeah. Your calculations, of course, are right in line with, again, a shout out to that website, Dr. Saxton's, and he also estimates the amount of power that the Death Star would consume, and so if you were just taking a direct matter to energy conversion to power up the Death Star to get that burst, it's on the order of taking Mount Everest and consuming an entire mountain the size of Mount Everest for every shot. So they have some very impressive, very efficient technology, because if they had even 1% waste heat, the Death Star itself would melt.
Well, wow. Saxton speculates that hyper energies, that like a captured black hole using Hawking radiation. Because you can't be consuming a mountain every second, because you just don't have that much storage capacity.
So you have to have a second sort of Death Star trailer off behind it, just for the mass to do the E equals MC squared conversion, right?
Yeah.
So Peter, if you've got a Yoda joule laser or a million Yoda joule laser, what do the mirrors look like on this thing?
The mirrors?
Yeah.
Well.
Can you use mirrors? Is it just going to vaporize? What does your laser look like?
So.
What does the Yoda joule laser look like?
So in the old Star Wars days, back in the Reagan days, we used cryogenically cooled metal mirrors. So we were cooling the mirrors with enormous radiators, and I would imagine superconducting to lower the surface temperature. But even that, I mean, I think there might be metamaterials that we aren't dealing with today that these people probably do use, that don't require actual physical matter that as we know it, that can act as lenses. I mean, certainly when you see the Death Star firing, you see all these beams converging, forming something that comes off in a straight line. Well, we know that lasers don't work like that. They just pass through each other, keep going. So there's something there that we can't see. So imagine a metamaterial that they are projecting that acts as a collimator at that point.
To focus these individual beams.
Focus it.
Or, because I think, as Cathy pointed out earlier, they appear to be using ion beam technology, so that's why you can deflect it. And the ion beams, you have to cancel out your momentum as these beams converge. The lasers don't interact, but again pass through each other. Somehow they have beams canceling out the the transverse momentum, and so you're only ending up with a beam going forward. So we would go, I believe, with some type of ion beam or antimatter and antimatter technology.
We're not working on that, by the way.
Yeah, no.
So speaking
or something, if we go into their universe, maybe they have a beam that turns off the strong force interaction, and so you just have this beam that travels into the matter, turns off the binding energy of these atoms, and your planet falls apart, essentially. So that's their universe, not ours.
Yeah, but you don't really have to blow the whole planet apart. All you have to do is unload the crust. If you can peel the crust off using this binding energy voodoo, then the mantle is under such high pressure from having had that heavy crust on top of it that if you suddenly unloaded that, the whole thing would just blow up anyway.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Well, Chris, you were speculating on ways to destroy a planet, weren't you?
So if we go that matter-antimatter route, if you had some sort of antimatter beam, you just had to point it at the planet and allow the matter-antimatter interactions to release energy, and maybe you'd have to only provide a lot less energy than we previously calculated. If we only need to get rid of the crust, also maybe there's something there too.
Or even just a smallish spot on the crust. If you took off something the size of a continent, then all of a sudden you've got a continent-sized supervolcano turning the planet inside out, potentially.
Now we're talking. I like this. So we might need a lot less energy than a Yoda watt or Yoda joule. Interesting.
Well, potentially.
Cool. All right. So we have another question. This is probably everybody's just own opinion. Which is more powerful, phasers or blasters?
Mixing the universes.
That's right.
As we recall, this was the engine room of the Starship Enterprise, but we aren't plugging that universe.
Well, the blasters look like they're sending individual packets of energy, like little packets of plasma, and the phasers are acting more like lasers.
Like lasers.
Now you imagine you can point a laser pointer at something and hit it and follow it around the room pretty easily without losing track of it. If you're firing a projectile like one of these blaster energy packets, you have a much more difficult time hitting a target. So I think the Star Trek people with their phasers would be more effective at hitting their targets than the Star Wars people with their blasters shooting these energy packets.
So I like
As to which is putting up more power, I don't know.
Well, I think we'd have to then defer that since they're in the Star Trek universe, they are always hitting each other with phasers and absorbing that energy, whereas it looked like in the Star Wars universe, if you actually got hit by a blaster, you're, I mean, there are cloned Star Troopers, the Death Star Troopers, falling over like flies continuously with basically one or two hits. So I'm going to go blaster, of course not as efficient as the power of the Force, but the blaster technology more powerful than phaser technology.
All right.
That's my vote.
I'm going to go the other way. Go the other way. I think the phasers look more scalable because nobody went up against the Death Star using a blaster. They went straight up to the proton torpedoes for the Death Star. But the phasers were the main weapon against the Borg cubes. The proton torpedoes were sort of there, but it was all about the phasers for destroying that big old cube, which is, different geometry, probably about the same sort of size and mass, I'm betting. So I think phasers sound more scalable. They can go from handheld up to full-on Death Star destroying thing, whereas the blasters can get up to maybe a short-range fighter for the blaster cannons that they're using on the surface of Death Star, or that they're using on the Millennium Falcon to go after the short-range snub fighters. But much beyond that, they don't seem to even bother. They go to bigger weapons. So it doesn't seem like it's quite as scalable, even though it might well be more efficient.
So I love this discussion of the figure of merit that we're trying to create here. On one end, we have we're looking at the accuracy of the blasters and the accuracy of the phasers, and then I'd like to add into it kind of like the purpose of these things are to disable an enemy, maybe kill them. So I think in the figure of merit there should be kind of a how effective is the weapon instead of just how powerful it is. And in the Star Wars universe, I feel there have been a lot more misses than actual hits using their blasters. And whereas with phasers, it seems phasers usually never miss. So I'm going to agree with Cathy and say I like the phasers better with this figure of merit.
Great. Awesome. So
Sounds like it's high. Right?
I'm going with Cathy.
We're going to defer. We're going to defer to the computational theoretical physicist from Los Alamos.
Oh, I think that's a first. Can I get that in writing?
For this particular segment.
So next time we have a phaser blaster question, we're deferring to you.
Awesome.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up here. We have one final question, I think, that kind of like speaks to, I don't know, some people are having questions about why are we even doing this in the first place? Like, why are we answering questions about a fictional universe instead of the real world? Whereas I feel like this is pretty important because science fiction actually inspires a lot of scientists today, and these new Star Wars movies are going to inspire the next generation of scientists. So I wanted to get everybody's take on the importance of science fiction in pop culture, but also like in the real world.
Well, I think for me, the Star Wars movie came out in 1977. I was a couple years from graduating from high school, which now you know my age. But in that case, I really was inspired by the land speeder, and my favorite quote was the fact when he's trying to sell it. Ever since the XP-38 came out, they just aren't in demand, and so he could only sell it for 2,500 credits, which allowed him
to travel across
the galaxy. And so for me, Star Wars was an inspiration, along with Star Trek, to go and explore science and think about things differently.
Yeah, and I started reading science fiction novels when I was in my early teens, and there are some hard science fiction authors like Hal Clement, and then there are some very fanciful science fiction authors, and I would say that the Star Wars is probably in the space opera range of that. But they're all fiction, they're all speculative, they're all inspiring, and it kept me interested in science, and here I am.
And we're hoping a discussion like this
inspires other people.
Inspires the next generation of young people to come and work within the Department of Energy National Labs.
Maybe you can answer that phaser blaster question.
Shall?
I can't really add much to what the others have said. I mean, I think we're all kind of in that boat of science fiction inspired us in one way or another, and that's why it's beautiful, and that's why I'm here. If we can inspire just a single person to think of something new and outside the box to help them in their day or help civilization, wonderful.
Well, I think it just comes down to the fact that dreams matter to people. Back on my bookshelf behind me here, I have some great textbooks. I have, Griffith's Quantum Mechanics. I have, who else do I have here? I have Carolyn Osley's Astrophysics, and I have, all kinds of fun stuff. Boyce and DePrima's Differential Equations. All these great books that changed my life and how I think and how I got through grad school and got my PhD. But the books that got me to pursue science, to pursue a PhD, and to be able to do any of this stuff at all was the books next to it. Carl Sagan's Contact, Asimov's short stories, learning how to think analytically from the old Sherlock Holmes stories. You know, some of these aren't even science fiction, but dreams matter, myths matter, the stories we tell ourselves matter. There's the things that get us up in the morning and get us out into the field, even if it's raining, to go get that one particular rock, or stay until 2 in the morning to finish that calculation. And that's the fuel in my warp drive. And I think it's that way for a lot of people, and that's why I continue to be a part of the Fanish community and go to science fiction conventions to talk about space and to talk about Mars and asteroids and what this amazing universe is. I think it really does matter, and I'm really grateful to the people who write these stories that give us something to show people. Hey, this, you know, maybe this couldn't happen, but big dreams can happen.
Inspiring stuff. And
certainly, I mean, from our perspective, I believe I've watched. I'm sure Dr. Patel and Dr. Plesko, Cathy and Vishal do this as well. But we work on expanding your horizons. You try to reach out to that next generation of people, because when I was growing up, people would have these science summer camps. I have no idea why they did it. You know, it was free. I would sign up. You'd show up every day, and you would just be doing small science projects the entire time. And I think we're all in the boat of trying to give back and inspire that next generation. And writers do that, and I think national lab employees can do that as well.
All right, excellent. Well, that was a fantastic discussion, and thank you all for joining us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. It was really appreciate all of you amazing panelists for taking time out and participating in this discussion about the energy of Star Wars. And thanks to all the viewers who have tuned in, and may the Force be with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.